Hello, Stephanie. It is
Hi,
such a pleasure to finally catch up and to talk about your incredible book. How are you?
very well, thank you.
I I actually got in touch with Stephanie because I read this book, and I now tell every single woman that works with me to read it because it's absolutely brilliant. Fake, a startling true story of love in a world of liars, cheats, narcissists, fantasists, and phonies. I think we've got them all covered there, don't you? So it's Stephanie Wood, a journalist and author of this incredible book, and I could not put it down. I literally read it in one sitting over a weekend. So congratulations, Stephanie. It really is an incredible book.
Thank you so very much. I worked very hard to make it pacey because, as any woman who's been in these sorts of romances knows, they are pacey. There are so many twists and turns and endless sort of highs and lows. So I suppose it wasn't actually that difficult to give it the feel of a novel in a way, because it's so unrealistic. It's so beyond anyone's wildest imagine what can happen in these relationships. It's like from a script.
Yeah, it's so appropriate to my audience. But what I thought was so incredible, Stephanie, was that it starts off. I won't give away the twist yet, but it starts off as a detective story. And you have me on the edge of my seat as you are going to in search of a man that you didn't know, yet you'd been in love with him for quite some time. Who was this guy?
Um, well, let's start with the guy I thought he was. I call him Joe in the book, which is not his real name. My editor and publisher and I decided it was a more literary, more elegant from a literary point of view not to name him, because it wasn't ever meant to be a gotcha book. It was never meant to be an act of revenge or vengeance. It was really my attempt to understand what had happened to me in this relationship. And simultaneously, I'd also always wanted to write a book. This wasn't the one that I set out to write, but I wanted it to be a reflection of me, but also to talk to other women. So that's a little bit off topic. But Joe, as I call him, um, purported to be a wealthy part-time farmer, retired architect, wheeler dealer, property developer with his finger in a lot of pies, interested in the environment, the countryside, dogs, in the environment, lots of things that sort of pushed my buttons, and I went, oh my God, he sounds perfect. He claimed to live with his two children from the marriage that had fallen apart in a harbourside home in Sydney. He drove a very beaten up old Land Rover Defender that he said was a collector's item. And my brother had always said, oh, I really want a Land Rover Defender, which had sort of embedded itself in my brain and made me think, oh, it's okay that a rich man should drive a Land Rover Defender. I should also add that I wasn't very interested in his money. I was interested in him.
Yeah.
But that wasn't who he really was.
So he
And I spent 14 months with him thinking that that's who he was. There was lots of very strange, lots of cancellations, which he always had some great excuses that were very believable. He'd convinced me that his ex-wife had mental health problems and they shared custody, but when she dropped the ball on the custody arrangements, he had to flee frequently to rescue the children from one or other situation. Because he talked so knowledgeably and in such detail about his business projects, that laid the groundwork for him to frequently desert me to go off to business meetings or to go and sign especially important documents or have lawyers meetings. And his stories were so very credible. He was really smart. He was so very clever in how he wove the stories. No, I wasn't seeing evidence for a lot of this, but there were certain things that I found in just very sort of superficial Google searches that proved some of the truth of his story. He told me his grandfather was a very wealthy business person. a very notable Australian business person, actually, and that was indeed true. There's no question about that. I'd seen a Harbourside address on his driver's license, which he'd pulled out one day in front of me. You know, so there are certain anchors to my belief systems about him that were confirmed, that were undeniably true, and I placed a lot of emphasis on that. I didn't see the Harbourside house. There was one excuse after another. In the early days, it was that the children weren't ready for me to go there because they'd been so damaged by the divorce. And, you know, I'm a reasonable woman with hopefully a fairly tender heart. And I just thought, I'm not going to barge in there and be a pushy woman and demand to see his house. I'm dealing with a really fragile situation here. And if it's to work, I need to be gentle about this and wait and be patient. So I let the house, you know, the month, I told him it was a deal breaker that I would eventually need to see the house, but the months went by. A couple of times we planned for me to go to the house for a dinner, and then of course something would come up and I couldn't go to the house. The daughter would be sick or had forgotten some arrangement she had that he needed to get her to. So, you know, one thing led to another. I didn't see the house.
It's a real classic example of coercive control, actually, where, or narcissism, where they say one thing and then do something completely different. But there's enough sort of enough truth there to make you think, oh, okay, it's legitimate.
Yeah.
But then it's never quite as it seems. And
No.
So what was I'd love to get into that in more detail in a moment, but what I thought was so incredible was once you started to get an inkling that this isn't all that it seems, halfway through the book, which I thought was really amazing, was you suddenly, after, you know, you've been in this relationship, the disappearances get longer and longer, further and further, longer and longer, and the quality time and the loving time he spends with you gets less, which is a classic sort of
reel you in and then
classic behavior, which I definitely want to get into more of in a minute. But you then and it broke your heart, completely broke your heart, and led you almost.
It also turned me into from very early on in the relationship, I became very anxious. I suffer a little bit of anxiety in certain situations, and this just hit me like a steamroller. I was an absolute mess. And I think it probably wasn't that far off being admitted to a psych ward, a mental health ward at the end of the relationship because of the state I was in. It was just such a mind fuck. Like, excuse my language. It was just, everything I had hoped and thought to be true was almost completely the opposite. And I think we're most of us are raised to believe in the goodness of people. And I once said to him, "You're not playing me, are you? You're not having taking me for a ride, are you?" And he said, "Oh, I can't lie. No. My face goes red." And in hindsight, it was such a bloody cliched answer. My face goes red. I should have known he probably was lying.
Yeah, they're very good at saying they're actually projecting onto you what you want to hear and manipulating vulnerability. Let's get to that in a minute. But so halfway through the book, you take off, you know, once you've completely broken down, and he's literally broken you down by just giving you those, you know, love bombing you fully at the start. And then gradually you get less and less and less and less and less.
And also at the start, making me believe we had a future together. Absolutely. And also tying me up in the purchase of this very large country estate that he said he was buying, that he said he had visions of me in the kitchen there. He asked me whether I wanted the study next to his or the study right down the long hallway. So he took me there to meet the owners. It was an appointment only style of property for sale. It's very lush. So he wrapped me up with a little, you know, in a package. So I started to see my future with him, thanks to the things he was saying.
And so halfway through the book, you took off this the hat of being in the relationship with him, and you put your journalist's hat on, and then you go in search of who is this guy really, who has brought me to my knees in a nervous breakdown. And that's what I think is so brilliant, because while you expose him and the lies and what you went through and really expose yourself to the world in this book, you also give an incredible insight into what coercive control and emotional abuse is. So what did you find? Well, actually, can we go back to the start again? So your impressions of him were that he's a stable guy. His level of detail in these lies was incredible, wasn't it?
Really incredible. So incredible. I don't even know how he kept his stories straight. And I wonder now if the fact that he was spending less and less time with me towards the end of our time together, which was only 14 months, but you can sink pretty deep into a relationship in 14 months. And he was spending less and less time towards the end with me, and seemed to be, we used to have a bit of wine together. He seemed to be drinking a bit less now that I think about it. And I wonder now if that wasn't because he knew he had told me so many stories that he was going to get himself caught out at some point, because he told me so much. There were contradictions, and I used to say, but hang on, you said X and now you're saying Y. And then he'd always have these really incredible reasons for why X hadn't happened, and now we were at Y, I suppose you could say. But it was really important for me when I wrote Fake that it was more than just my story. It had to be an analysis, I suppose, of the human heart and love, and why we fall so heavily and make such, there are lots of people out there who would say I was stupid. And certainly I've called myself that a few times. But I'm not a stupid woman. I write very complex pieces of journalism, long form, I analyze huge amounts of data to put stories together. I'm not stupid, but what we do with our human heart is very different from what we do in the course of our work. And I wanted to understand why we make the decisions we do about love and about the people we choose to be in love with. And so my exploration in the book goes from what our brains do to us when we're in love, the sort of chemicals and the neurotransmitters and the hormones, and how they're just flooding our brain when we're first falling in love, and completely leading us into really misguided courses of thinking. I mean, our frontal lobe, which is responsible for sound decision making and judgment, it's just not working properly. I also looked at cognitive psychology and what that has to say. Cognitive science, not psychology. And cognitive science is this whole field that I didn't even know existed, about the sorts of decisions we make and how, in hindsight, we can see things that are not evident when we're on the spot at the time. It's a fascinating thing. And one of the things that really sort of was a light bulb moment for me when I was looking into cognitive behavioral science was the concept of anchoring and anchors. So, for example, I knew that his grandfather was this very well-known Australian business person, and I knew that for a fact. I'd seen his driver's license with that Harbourside address on it. And so I made those anchors about my knowledge about this man, Joe, when I should have in fact been looking at other things as far more important than those two things. Turned out Joe didn't even live in the house. His wife had got it in the divorce. He had lived in it once, and he had owned it once. But so, there was an element of truth in so many of the things he said to me, but only an element.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then what happened as you went on? Because you describe, I'd love to know what happened as you went on, because what you describe is, at the beginning, we get drunk with love, as you describe in your book.
Yeah.
And that state makes us want to see the good in people. You've got enough anchors there, as you say, that make you think, well, he is a reasonable human being. And most of us do see the good in people. Then we're not assuming they're going to be out to con us.
No.
So what happened as I want to break down this relationship, because it is coercive control. And I get so so many people say, oh, why do women stay in these relationships? I got asked that myself when I was in an abusive relationship. Why didn't you just leave? So it's really good for us to explore that. So what happened as you progressed through that relationship? Obviously, at first, he's saying everything you want to hear. You're in that feeling of love and projecting onto him all your hope for the future and everything. And so you're vulnerable then. What happens as it progresses?
Well, I became more and more anxious, as I said, and I think my decision-making abilities got worse because of the anxiety. I was in no state to be making sensible decisions about anything by the sort of towards the sort of halfway mark of the relationship. And I think also I was addicted to, there's something I heard domestic violence survivors say on the radio, that a line that I used in the book. I was addicted to hope. I just kept hoping that, you know, all of these things he'd told me would come to fruition. And that was a really powerful momentum. I'd been single for quite some, you know, maybe 5, 6, 7 years before I met him. I was in my mid-40s when I met him. I might be, okay, late 40s, well, let's be honest about it. And, you know, it's the world is not built to be a single woman, especially not a single woman in her 40s. We're very much a couple society, and it's not, I'd been lonely. I'd been very transitory through my 20s and 30s. I'd moved overseas. Lived in London and Hong Kong. I'd lived in Melbourne and Brisbane. And when I met him, I was living in Sydney. So when you move around so much for work, which I'd done, your roots aren't very stable in any place. And I had friends all over the place, but in the cities wherever I was living, the friendships were more superficial, because obviously it takes so much time to make really solid friends. And my school friends and my university friends and my first job friends were all in other cities. And so every city I moved to, I had to make new friends. And that's always really challenging. And when you hit 40, the people of your age, your contemporaries, are generally in playgrounds and helping out at the school fete and on side of sports ovals. And that wasn't, you know, I didn't have children, so I wasn't meeting people through those sorts of normal ways that you meet people. And I'm a bit of an introvert, and it's hard for me. Like, no one would ever know I was an introvert when they meet me, but I do prefer a lot of the time my own company, but that works against me. So, long answer to your question, being lonely had also, you know, suddenly I was a we with this man. You know, I could say, we're going away this weekend, until he cancelled. And that, you know, it's all becomes a very potent mix of longing and desire, and, you know, the intimacy of it. I'd been celibate for some years, and I like sex. So, yeah, it was potent. But I think by the sort of, I don't know, maybe 12 months into the relationship, I knew it was not looking very good. But you hold on to that hope, you keep holding on. The deal breaker was the deal breaker. Twice in a row, he cancelled on me going to see his house. And after that, I realised something's on. I don't know what it is, but there's something wrong here, and it's not going to change. And that's when I pulled the plug. And that gives me some small satisfaction that I did walk away from it at that point. So, yeah.
You bring up some really good points, and I hope you don't mind me sort of just highlighting them, because I see it over and over again, that really, you know, these guys are very good at what they do, and they are predatory. They look for a weakness in us.
Absolutely.
We could be a man or a woman, but I'll just say women for the moment, because the bulk of abusive relationships are women as the victims. They identify a weakness in us. And that might be being our age and lonely, or being, you know, time ticking for having a baby. I know another woman said that she felt that vulnerability. And then they they basically mirror us. They tell us everything we want to hear. They're very good at doing that. And so you think you've got this future, you think you've got this hope, then they test your boundaries, which is what he did by suddenly giving you these excuses and
How much is
disappearing.
she going to put up with? What, you know, what can I do? Yeah.
And then once you do that, because as you say, they're very good at giving plausible excuses, or worse, gaslighting, going, oh, you're imagining that. It's not as bad as you think, sort of thing. Then the trauma bond builds. And it is that fantasy bond. As you said, you cling to hope. You cling to the fantasy of what they've promised life will be like. And I remember you saying that you were drunk with love. You were caught between drunk with love and terror he was going to disappear. Can you describe that for me?
Well, I mean, I
remember that feeling so well myself.
Yeah, I think deep within me there is something, and I don't know what it is about. I have fear of being abandoned that has manifest itself in other relationships, even within family relationships. Fear of being deserted. I don't know where it comes from, but it's there, and so that's probably one of the biggest contributors to my anxiety levels was that fear. That's, you know, I can survive on my own for many years quite happily, and I wouldn't just go out with anyone. But the moment I'm in that relationship, that's when the fear builds. You know, I'm not so desperate that I'm going to go out with anyone, and I didn't even date. I didn't even try and date through the years that I was single. A couple of online dates was all it took for me to realize, like, I don't want to be there. But yeah, something very powerful was triggered in me, and I fear could be again at some point in the future. Should the circumstances arise that the abandonment feeling gets me. Which, I didn't talk a lot about that in the book, so I didn't explore that a great deal, but I think it was there.
But that's where the addiction comes in, because they set you up. They destroy they have you on eggshells and on edge for so long that your self-esteem is chipped away at.
Yeah, absolutely. My self-esteem was I was a mess. I was drinking too much. I looked crap. Yeah, I was, I'd started the relationship. I'd lost some weight. I was feeling glorious. And by the end of it, I was just a shadow of myself. But, I think one of the things that the book also covers, and I think this is really, really important. I think we should be removing some of the blame from ourselves. This man behaved in a truly evil and reprehensible fashion. And
absolutely,
we need to look at the behavior of these men just as much, if probably more so than we search ourselves for understanding. And that fake very much is about, as you know, I devote a few chapters to talking about what makes men and some women, it's not just men that behave this way, although the evidence that I've got from the huge volume of correspondence I've received, the evidence I've got suggests that it's much more likely to be a man that will behave this way than a woman. But as I spent a lot of time in the book looking at the behavioral patterns of these people and what it points to. Now, I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I can't diagnose Joe, but I can certainly say that all of his behavioral patterns, which I discover in the course of my research for the book, date back many, many years. He's behaved this way in business relationships, in other relationships with his ex-wife. It's a pattern of behavior, and that pattern of behavior is, if it reflects what I understand personality disorders to be, like in a nutshell. And by personality disorders, we talk about things like psychopathy and sociopathy, although those terms are no longer used in the American manual, the DSM-5, the latest mental health manual that American psychiatrists use, and which is considered the Bible. Those psychopathy and antisocial disorder, personality disorder, now fall under what's called antisocial personality disorder. And the other one that was relevant, I think, in my case, was narcissistic personality disorder. And so I spent a lot of time in the book, and as I tried to understand what had happened, working out who does this.
Mm.
And it's generally people, I believe, with personality disorders. And generally people with personality disorders don't recover from personality disorders because
No,
they refuse to acknowledge
I
that
agree.
there is a problem. They don't seek help. It's
Yeah.
always someone else's fault. They play the victims just beautifully. And that fitted Joe's pattern. Everyone in Joe's life had done him wrong.
Yes.
And now I've done him wrong. I know that he's out there saying all sorts of things about me.
Well, it's more complicated than that, because what I was sort of getting to before was that they identify an Achilles heel, if you like,
Yeah,
then they hone in on it. They identify, right, she's right for my grooming. Then they groom you by testing your boundaries, it's a really insidious process.
yeah.
And then once they've done that,
But a normal person wouldn't do that, I guess is my point.
no, they're completely narcissistic. It is abusive. They
Yeah,
chip away at your self-esteem because it makes them feel great about themselves.
yeah.
Have you totally dependent on them,
Mm-hmm.
and
It's a power for them.
and you end up addicted to them, because what's so horribly insidious about this form of psychological brainwashing is that the very person who makes you feel good about yourself again is the person who's been abusing you and
Yeah.
ground you down like that.
Yeah, they hold all the power over all of your emotions.
Yeah, and he was, and the gap between that reality of what he said and who he was, and then what else did you discover? He was doing this to another woman.
All the time. From day one that I was with him, he was with someone else.
Yeah.
Possibly, I suspect he was dating other women as well.
Yeah.
I did hear from other women he dated earlier, but anything's possible. Anything is possible with this guy. You wouldn't know.
Well, in the UK, coercive control is now deemed a crime. They deem it a level of brainwashing and emotional abuse. But so many women, and I'd love to ask you, did you realize it was an emotionally abusive relationship when you were
No. I didn't realize that till much later. I'd started to realize that he was bad. I discovered he had a criminal history, or a criminal conviction for fraud under his belt, or for a fraud-related offence. I discovered he was bankrupt, and he certainly wasn't in a position to be buying any sort of property. And then I interviewed a former business partner of his, and gradually the puzzle started to assemble of who he really was. And he was a shyster in both romance and business. And I could see, it took me then, it was all it was also very overwhelming for such a long time, because it was there's so much cognitive dissonance involved in it. And my thinking was I was so discombobulated about it all. And, I had to work my way through the grief, a depression that followed. I had to get my work had suffered. My most important thing in my life, my work had suffered, and I had to get myself back to work and try and churn out some good stories, which I did. And I won 2 awards for my journalism that year, and stories that had nothing to do with him. It was a slow process to come to the realization that I'd been emotionally abused.
Mm.
I don't even know. I don't even use that expression in the book. I think it's still dawning on me. If I were to write the book now, I would probably write quite a different book, or I'd certainly have more in it that I can see now on reflection. And I keep hearing from people that know him and know of him and know of his appalling behaviour. I heard from someone last week that shared a whole lot of really interesting new insights. But I don't seek out information now. I've really moved on. I had a flurry of new contacts from people last week because a radio program here rebroadcast something that an interview I'd done last year, and that drew out of the woodwork a whole lot of new people that contacted me. I don't know that I'll ever fully come to terms with it, because it was just so truly bizarre. I mean, I didn't get beaten up. I didn't lose any money. And that's something else I should add. I'd always known there were con artists that took women's money. he never once asked me for money. And so I think that was another thing I anchored my
Yeah.
thinking process about him on. He's not asking me for, I mean, there were times I said to myself, is he a fantasist? You know, these stories that he'd tell me. But then I'd go, well, he's not asking me for money. And I'd never heard of men that would behave this way without a financial motive.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I couldn't see what his motive was. And so, you know, I suppose that was another thing that definitely kept me thinking, no, he must be genuine. But yeah, it just, I think it's just, it was such a revelation. And I think as I said, I'm still getting emails from women. I mean, I've had hundreds, and each one is that people have been incredibly generous and frank with their stories that they tell me about their situations. And I mean, it's just dazzling to me, the number of people out there that have been affected by these narcissistic characters. And I feel we now use the word narcissistic way too lightly, because it's a disorder.
It is.
And, you know, I think it's all very well to do the soul searching that I've done myself to understand the vulnerabilities that led me to this bloke. But we need to also be placing much more I'm pleased to hear what you said about the UK, because you know, there used to be in Australia historically, there was something called a tort of deceit, which was illegal. You know, you could sue someone. Women sued men for breaking their hearts and breaking their promises of marriage. And I don't have a huge understanding of this, but I think it was around the time that no fault divorce came in the late 60s, early 70s, that the tort of deceit was done away with. There used to be laws that protected women to a point from these sorts of characters. And I mean, I would have happily stood up in court against him, but there were no charges that I could see that there was no crime that he had actually committed.
That would make it even more confusing. I can see that.
Yeah.
In the book, you did meet others who say what so many women say to me, and I myself said about myself, how did I ever end up in something like that?
Yeah.
And that's what people can't understand. They think, well, why didn't she just leave? But if you've been through it, you understand how you got through it.
It's so very complex. It's just deeply complex. And I think it's.
How did it feel when you met them? Did you feel like, oh, I'm not such an idiot? I'm less alone. This happened more than I think.
Yeah, I think so. I know that that's what people tell me. Thank you for writing the book, because it's made me feel less alone. I now feel such a sense of like relief that someone else has expressed these things and explained things to me. So the book has certainly helped other people. I think I helped myself with writing the book. I started to see what had happened. So yeah, it's been a long process.
Yeah. It must have been a really, it's your memoir as well. It's very, I mean, talk about exposing your vulnerable underbelly to the world.
Yeah.
What was the process like?
I was on such a tight deadline that I didn't really have a lot of time to fall apart and be emotional about it. I just had to keep charging on, and I haven't really fallen apart emotionally. Like, I just became a machine. I didn't drink. I was up at 5 every morning and in bed at midnight every night. It was just nuts. And I also did to give the book an upward, maybe I shouldn't give away the ending, but it has an upward lift and a positive ending, which also required some extra work. So I didn't want the book ever to sound like I was a victim or I was defeated or I was a complainer. I wanted to sound strong in it, and I hope that was I've come back better than I was before. So I hope that's how it comes across.
I always say to women, yeah, it really does. And honestly, I'm recommending to everybody. I just want to show it again, because it really makes you realize this happens to so many of us.
Yeah.
They are very, very good at what they do.
And as you know, there are stories in there of other women and what they've been through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other women, broadening it out to those other women whose stories just correlated with yours, including the other woman that he was doing it to you at the same time. It's an incredible insight into emotional abuse, coercive control, narcissistic, psychological manipulation, brainwashing, whatever you want to call it. And it serves as a great warning for people who've not been through it as well. And I was wanting to ask you, I always say to people, don't watch what people say, watch what they do.
Yeah,
especially
that's so important
on a first date, because these guys actually show you who they are from the beginning. What happens is, as you say, we're drunk with love, we're drunk with hope, we're drunk with seeing the good side in everybody, because who's going to sit there always thinking, is this person conning me? But what is it that you would say were the red flags and warning signs that were there in the early days that your brain overrode, that could serve as a warning to others?
A couple of the things that I think were red flags about his personality probably aren't the biggest red flags. I mean, he was very pretentious. He wasn't very pretentious. He showed flashes that possibly he was pretentious. And as I detail in more detail in the book, and when I sort of pulled him up on it and said, oh no, I'm not like that, or no, I don't like that, he did these great feats of backtracking to explain, oh no, that's not what I meant. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt and went, oh, okay, maybe you're not. But the red flags that I would say now after the 14 months of the relationship were, if you feel, if the stories are confused, if he contradicts himself, if there's a lot of contradictory stories, something's going on. No one contradicts themselves as much as this man did, or even a little bit. Most people's stories are fairly consistent. Yeah. If he's always blaming other people for things, if someone else has always done something to hurt him, if he says his ex-wife is a psychopath or mad.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
That's a big one. Don't believe it. A nice man won't be talking about his ex-wife that way, even if she does have mental health problems. The victim thing, and the showing, not telling. What are his actions? Not what are his words? Because anyone can pull out some words of flattery. You can look up on the internet and find, if you're short of language skills, you can find some words of phrases of flattery on the internet. Ignore the flattery. That's just so cheap and easy. What is he actually doing? Where's he taking you? How's he helping you? How's he supporting you? Yeah. Is he being true to his word? Is he fulfilling commitments? Is he not standing you up all the time? And if I mean, obviously, if there's any sort of suggestion of physical menace or abuse or monetary, get out of there as fast as you can, if it's early and you're not too enmeshed. But there are a few of the things that I'd be suggesting you watch out for now.
And I'd add trusting your gut, because when our gut starts to stir and thinks something's wrong, and then they go, well, no, you're imagining it, or they gaslight you, then we sort of think, oh, okay, maybe my gut's not right. But it's a really good indicator that if your gut is stirring, then they are emotionally manipulating in you in some way.
Yeah.
It's a really, really good sign. But I'd love to just end on, that's really helpful. Thank you. I know that will help a lot of women. And I just want to end on a really hopeful note, because he didn't destroy you. He did a pretty good job, but he didn't destroy you. And how, I always say that these experiences are so awful when we go through them, but they haven't won if we can learn something about ourselves and grow from it, so that we never settle for less than we deserve ever again. Not that that's you settling for it, so that we're never vulnerable to being groomed and manipulated and abused like that ever again, is a better way of putting it. So what have you learned now, and how is life now?
Listen, everyone's life is up and down, particularly in this time. It's not perfect, no, but whose life is perfect? But I feel stronger than I've ever felt before. I'm worrying about work. My industry of media is not doing terribly well, and I've got work, but it's uncertain. But I'm feeling strong, and I'm feeling good, and I'm working on another book idea, and it has nothing to do with men or relationships. Nothing whatsoever to do with him. It's not even remotely informed by him. And yeah, the only time I think about him is when something's replayed, like this interview last week, or I have to do an interview, choose to do an interview with someone like you to talk about the book. I do really feel that there is a lot of wisdom in there, particularly for younger women that,
huge amount, yeah,
haven't sort of embarked on the world of dating yet.
Yeah, because yes, they are at fault for their behavior, but I also think, a book like this really will arm any woman into knowing what to look for, knowing how to, see the warning signs they're being groomed, or because 1 in 4 women do become victims of abuse. And so at least if you know what those signs are, you're armed to spot this sort of, because they're so good at just making you feel amazing in the beginning. Yeah. And pressing those vulnerabilities. So I urge any woman to read this. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And just apart from that, Stephanie, it's just such a beautiful read.
Oh, thank you.
It's poetic. Your use of words, and just the way you describe your emotions, or what you're feeling, or what anyone would relate to that. And
thank you.
So that's why I found it very, very easy to read.
Thank you so much.
It's such a great lesson to any woman who's out there dating, or has any, as you say, gut feeling that something isn't quite right. Thank you so much for that.
You're so welcome.
And I'm glad you survived it, and hope that you go on to have, the life that you really hope of. Peace, freedom. What other words would you describe it? Just
joy.
Yeah, that you deserve.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now.
Bye.